their structural characteristics, which always lead to their function. Erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are biconcave. We talked about this in the last lecture, which increases the surface area. They lose their nucleus as they grow up so that they can actually carry more oxygen. And how they carry more oxygen is that they're 97% hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a protein in which we can transport oxygen. And one of the things, so they're cells like everybody else, or like everything else, and they actually have a function to perform and to keep themselves alive. They have to go through different chemical reactions, and they produce ATP just like any other cell. However, instead of producing it with oxygen present, they produce their ATP anaerobically, and so they don't use up the oxygen that is needed in the body. And we know that erythrocytes are dedicated to transport gases. So it's going to transport oxygen into the cell and then carbon dioxide out of the cell. And most of the oxygen in the blood is bound to hemoglobin. This HB is the abbreviation for hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is composed of a protein called globin that is bound to a heme group. And the heme group is bears an atom of iron. So if you've ever tasted blood, which I'm assuming you have, it is metallic in taste. And then each hemoglobin molecule can transport 4 molecules of oxygen throughout the body. Now this next term, hematopoiesis, should sound familiar. We learned about it in a couple of different chapters in our first semester work, but hematopoiesis is blood cell formation, and hematopoiesis occurs in red bone marrow. And you guys should remember where red bone marrow is located. It's in your axial skeletons, and when it says girdles, those are your shoulder girdles and your pelvic girdles, and then at the epiphyses of some long bones. Hemocytoblasts are what give rise to all formed elements. So that means that hemocytoblasts are going to give rise to red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Now, erythrocytes can't last forever, just like any other cell, so they have a programmed cell death called apoptosis, just like any other cell, and they actually live for about 100 to 120 days. And because they don't have a nucleus, they can't actually go through mitosis and replicate themselves. So what happens is they're going through and carrying all this oxygen, their cell membrane starts to become rigid and fragile. Their hemoglobin starts to degenerate, so they can't carry as much oxygen. And so eventually they're going to be engulfed by macrophages, which are going to phagocytize the red blood cells and break them down into parts that can be recycled. So it's going to break down the hemoglobin into heme and globin, and the iron is going to be salvaged from the heme. And then heme is going to be degraded into a yellow pigment called bilirubin. And bilirubin then goes into the liver secretes it into the intestines as bile. When we get to the last chapter, when we talked about bile, this is how you actually make bile, and it's stored in the gallbladder. And then globin is metabolized into amino acids and released into circulation. Now, unfortunately, there can be some erythrocyte disorders, and the most common type of erythrocyte disorder is anemia. And anemia just means that the erythrocyte itself, or red blood cell, cannot carry as much oxygen. And if it can't carry as much oxygen, you can't make as much ATP. And so your blood oxygen levels are low. And what that is going to cause, one of the main symptoms is fatigue. And then you can also bruise very easily, and there are some other symptoms that go along with the paleness, shortness of breath, and chills. Now, sickle cell anemia is a specific type of anemia that results from an abnormal or from a gene that causes an abnormal shape in the erythrocyte itself. It is an autosomal recessive disorder, and that's back from biology days, what that means, and it's just saying that it's on your chromosomes, on not your sex chromosomes, and it's recessive, so you have to get a recessive gene from both parents. And instead of the red blood cells being biconcave, some of them become sickle shaped. And if it's sickle shaped, it is unable to carry as much oxygen around the body. Now, we find sickle cell anemia in America, mostly in African Americans, because in Africa, where their ancestors came from, they have a problem with malaria. And so evolutionarily speaking, what happened is they evolved to have sickle cell anemia because sickle cell anemia gives you a malarial immunity. Unfortunately, the sickle cell anemia can actually be deadly because if you don't get enough oxygen to your organs start to shut down. But some people can live with sickle cell anemia and then also be immune to malaria. So it was a good thing for Africans at the time. In America, the African Americans don't necessarily need sickle cell anemia because we don't have malaria.